Uh, all right, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Shannon Raisler. I'm a faculty member here at the College of Law and the faculty director of the Hubble Environmental Law Initiative, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk, online as well. Hello out there to those watching virtually. I want to begin with some thank yous. As always, a big thank you to Fred and Charlotte Hubble for their generous support of the Hubble Environmental Law Initiative, which is sponsoring this wonderful event. A thank you to Blake Roop, our program director, who makes things just happen magically in my mind. It's my pleasure today to introduce Rob Verchick. He is an endowed chair in environmental law at Loyola University, New Orleans, the Francis B. Cashin Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, where he is this year working on another book, if you can believe it. A senior fellow in disaster resilience at Tulane University and president of the Center for Progressive Reform. And he also served in the Obama administration designing climate resilience policies, and is the author of 4 books and the host of the podcast Connect the Dots. We're also grateful that he agreed to be a guest speaker on River to River. Some of you may have heard him on IPR yesterday. We're fortunate to have him here today at the College of Law in Iowa City to talk about his recent book, The Octopus in the Parking Garage, A Call for Climate Resilience. I highly recommend that you read this book if you haven't already. Not only is it a very accessible, engaging book about an incredibly important topic, adapting to climate change, it's also a really enjoyable read. Professor Verchick is a wonderful storyteller. He tells stories about our human history of adapting to disaster and disruptive change and our contemporary efforts to adapt our social, legal, and political systems to the disruptions happening now and those to come. He does all this while weaving somehow compelling accounts of history, political theory, social, and the natural sciences. You'll also learn a lot about octopuses too. The octopus in the garage clearly symbolizes climate disruption, but as the book unfolds, you'll also learn that the octopus is an amazing creature with much to teach us about how to adapt to disruptive change. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Verchick. Oh, I should mention, so sorry. We will take questions. He's offered to take questions, and we have a microphone. Blake or I can come to you at the end of this talk, so keep that in mind.
And we can even sign some books at the end, too, because they're at the bookstore around the corner. I found that out. So
thank you.
Everybody, it's great to see you. And I just want to throw in my thanks too. I mean, I have been to Iowa several times working on climate resilience. This is something I'll tell you a little bit about later. But really glad to be here. I really want to thank Shannon Raislinger and Blake Roop and the Hubble Institute and the Policy Center as well. It's just been wonderful. Well, it's a little cool outside, a little crisp, but I want you to think way back, use your imagination a little bit, and imagine that instead of living here in Iowa City, Iowa, which is wonderful, imagine that you live in Miami Beach, Florida. And let me see here, I've just got to get this to move forward. Oh, I'm having trouble getting it to move forward.
Just to do this.
Okay, what do you do?
Sometimes. We'll see if this trick works.
All right.
See if it works. No? Okay, this might work.
There we go. Imagine you live there. And not just this. Imagine you are a realtor and your name is Richard Conlon, and you live in a condominium complex called the Mirador 1000, and it's beautiful. I was there just last spring, and it's on Biscayne Bay. You have beautiful views out there, right? And imagine that one day in 2016, you were walking into the parking garage that's connected to that building, and it was sort of early in the morning and you're still a little bit groggy and you go in that dark, staged parking garage and the fluorescent green lights are kind of flickering and you hear a gurgle, 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 and you put your foot down on the asphalt, except it's not asphalt. Your foot is in a pool of water up to beyond your ankles, okay? And then you look around to see where your car is and you hear a kind of flip, flop, flip, flop, flip, flop. And what you see when you squint in that garage is this. And if you were like Richard Conlon, what you do immediately is you take out your phone and you take pictures. You put it on Facebook and make videos, and that's exactly what he did. And he didn't know it yet, but he had just stepped into a climate change problem. And what he immediately did was call security. They came in there, they got a bucket, they got the little critter back in there, and the cephalopod was fine. But what he didn't understand until later is that the octopus got there because of climate change. Okay, so this is what happened. This staged parking garage is up high, and it's got a pipe that drains all the water down into Biscayne Bay. And those pipes ideally hang right above the surface of the water, right? And they go all the way up and down. Every apartment building has one of those things. Except now because of sea level rise, and at this time there was a moon, there was a super moon and a king tide and a bunch of other things, right? All happening at the same time, driving the water higher and higher and higher. And those pipes are underwater now. And so when there's a surge, it pushes the water all the way up into the pipe and takes this poor little cephalopod and pushes it all the way up. Now, if you want to know what the cephalopod was doing down there, eating, right? Because all of the pollution that's coming down this drain is something that attracts those octopuses. So anyway, this poor thing is out there, they get it back, and that's all fine. And if you were Richard Conlon, you would go along with your life on Facebook, I suppose. If you were me, and you found out about this, you would do the only thing that I know how to do as a law professor, which is write op-eds. And so a friend of mine, Dan Farber, who's out in California, we were sharing these pictures and we figured out what happened. We said, there's an op-ed here. And so we write this op-ed called The Octopus in the Parking Garage in the Miami Herald. And what we say is that this octopus is an 8-armed alarm bell for climate change, because if we can't keep sea life out of our parking garages, what else can't we do, right? And then I sat and thought about that, and I said, I want to turn my op-ed into a book, because that's the only other thing I know how to do. So I did, right? And it was Dan's. It was Dan's idea for a title, but he didn't have it, so I'm really happy about that. What we're going to do today is talk a little bit about that idea about what can we do if we, what are the things that we can't do that we need to know how to do at some point, because there's a lot of stuff going on. Just this last summer, we had wildfires from one end of the country to the other end of the country, the deadliest wildfire in modern history in Lahaina and Hawaii. We saw heat waves everywhere, including here, right? And especially in southern parts of Iowa, the 200 million Americans under heat alerts. We saw flooding from Cathedral City, California, all the way to Charleston, South Carolina. And the ocean, we know, is heating up. Down by the Marabou, down in Biscayne Bay, jacuzzi temperatures. And what I mean by that is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so what does that do to animal life? What does that do to folks in Iowa? Right, I just had a wonderful dinner last night of salmon, right? And so how is all of this stuff going to be affected? So those are some of the things that we need to think about. And I want you to consider that just last summer, more than half of all people in the United States experienced some kind of extreme weather event. And that is a trend that's going to get worse, not better. And no, this is not the new normal, because nobody has any idea what normal is going to look like. All right. And so this is something that has occupied me for a very long time working at a law school. And I'll tell you why. So we're in what I call a no analog future. Other experts, some scientists have used that term. And this is what we're seeing. That's just what I described to you. All right. This is what we're used to in terms of weather patterns and climate patterns. And so we are having suddenly to plan and develop ways of surviving in a future that we have no idea what it's going to look like. That's a problem for a lot of things, but that's a problem for law. The reason is that law in most societies and in the United States is mainly a conservative enterprise. And what I mean by that is conservative with a small c. Law is here to meet people's settled expectations, to build stability so that people can plan around things, plan their investments, plan where they're going to live, plan whom they're going to marry, all of those kinds of things. Law is here to stabilize. But how do you stabilize and meet people's expectations when the entire environment around you is changing faster than it ever has in human history, right? How do you anticipate that? Law has to get more flexible. So we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. We know that we have a lot at stake, right? We have millions of homes, trillions of dollars of assets, just at risk to sea level rise, not to mention the other things. Public health and productivity, heat extremes are going to steal 2 billion labor hours by the end of the century if we're not careful. And a lot of those labor hours are in agricultural places like Iowa. Right? Natural resources, think about all of the things that we rely on natural resources for, all those free goods and services, filtering water, providing water, creating habitats for fish and livestock and all kinds of things. All of those things are going to be on the ropes. And the economists who look at this tell us that if we don't learn how to adapt to this problem, we are going to lose every single year $500 billion. And just to keep that in mind, $500 billion is about the amount of expansion we see in the economy every year. All right. So instead of having an economy that expands every year, we're going to be paying a climate tax if we don't do something about it. Now, there are two things we have to do, and I hope you know, right? We have to reduce carbon. And just so we know what that involves, right? That involves mainly in the United States, it involves getting as much renewable electricity onto the grid as possible and electrifying as many things as possible. There's a whole many books you could read about that. I've got talks on that, but I'm not going to talk about that today. But that is job one. The other job one is we have to get resilient. And the reason that we have to get resilient is that we have to build a society using law and policy and the rest to manage these impacts that we're not going to be able to avoid. Reducing carbon helps us avoid the impacts we can't manage. Getting resilient helps us manage the impacts that we're not going to avoid. Why can't we avoid them? Science. All right. Those greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere, a big blanket, keeping everything too warm. That blanket of chemicals is going to stay in the atmosphere 50 to 100 years. All right. Even if we stop putting more of it up. And the heat that's already down here, 90% of that heat is in the ocean. You can be thankful for that. It's not here, right? It's in the ocean. It's a giant hot water bottle. And that hot water bottle is going to take generations to cool down. All right. So for the next 50 to 100 years, we are locked in to the things that I was just telling you about. Right. And so the only way we're going to be able to stretch our timeline out so that we can work on stuff is to be able to create more resilience. And I have to say, it's something that I wish more people were talking about and writing about. Right? That's why I wrote the book. When I first started doing this work as a law professor, sometime actually right around Hurricane Katrina, I moved to New Orleans 9 months before Hurricane Katrina, and I really did. After that, I said everything I do in my professional life is going to be about climate resilience, and in one way or another. And when I started getting involved in it, I got a lot of pushback. A lot of people say, "Oh, you're giving up." Even Al Gore. God bless Al Gore. He won the Nobel Prize. I'm very happy for it. He deserves it. But what he said back in the Earth in the Balance days was that adapting to climate change was lazy, right? And a lot of people thought that because they thought that meant giving in. But it's not giving in because we got 50 to 100 years. We got to do something. Right? Because cranking down carbon is not going to help in that way. So what can you do? Well, you can resist, right? This is I'm back in that picture somewhere in downtown New Orleans, protected by the largest pumping system in the world. So we hope that resistance is not always futile. When I have to evacuate with my family from storms, I take the twin span, and I'm glad that it's now several feet higher than it was during Hurricane Katrina. All right, so we can adjust. And there's a lot of adjustment going on in the country and around the world. And then sometimes, after a lot of deliberation and maybe not other ideas available to us, we have to just decide that we're going to retreat, either leave places or decide that we're not going to live in certain places. And that's something that's really hard. Now, I know that you are not strangers to climate change either. I learned that pigs could swim when I started studying the floods from 2008 here in Iowa. And when I was at EPA in the Obama administration, I actually worked on some pilot projects with the EPA, helping folks in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City and other places in the recovery efforts. You know a little something about this, and you also know a little something about resilience, because many of the projects that were rebuilt in this area, in this city, and this picture is from Cedar Rapids, are built with holding water and avoiding storms. And so these kinds of things you're used to. And lots of people, I think, are used to particular ideas like this. Learning, getting information out to people, that's something you learned about too. This is an amazing online system you have that didn't exist before 2008, right? So all of these things are adjustment, and you know how to do that. What I wanted to do in my book, and what I'm going to spend the next amount of time now, is thinking about how resilience happens. And what I wanted to do in writing this book was meet a lot of people and talk to a lot of people, because there are two parts to building climate resilience, to doing anything really of this scale. One is you need people who you're sometimes called champions, right? People who just get interested in something and never ever give up. Any one of you in this room could be a champion in that way. And I interviewed a lot of people. I'm not going to tell you about them all today, but I'm going to tell you about some of these folk, okay? The other thing that's really important to understand is that the biggest issues that we have right now are structural. They're not scientific, they're not engineering issues, they're political issues and economic issues and legal issues. And so we have to talk about how to reimagine the structure in which we operate. So I have this picture here. This is Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a good down payment on some kind of structural changes. Over $400 billion are going to be raised and distributed throughout the country to reduce carbon and to build climate resilience. Something like $20 to $30 billion in the next 5 to 10 years are going to come to Iowa in the form of private investment that's spurred because of the incentives that's in this new structural way of understanding government infrastructure and government spending. Here's the thing I want you to know about structural change. You don't get that without this. All right. I can draw a straight line all the way back to the Dakota Pipeline Standing Rock protests, which inspired the Sunrise Movement, which inspired members of Congress. And the Sunrise Movement, among many, many other groups, were instrumental in getting Joe Biden to agree to certain parts of the Green New Deal when he was running for president. So these things, none of them would have happened if they'd have been connected to other things, including the $20 to $30 billion that I was going to see in the next few years. There's a straight line. And so we need to think about people actually taking on what might look like small or sometimes quixotic uh, journeys and seeing what else they can develop. So here's one story I start with. And when I was working on the book and looking for stories, it was really important for me to think about places that I knew because I wanted to meet people that were connected to things that I knew about. And I wanted to feel what was happening in, in the stories that I was talking about. So I spent some time up in Washington, and I write about this in the book. This is a bay on Whidbey Island. I have not filtered that picture. That's what the sky looked when I took the picture. And that's because this was during the Labor Day fires that were occurring east of Western Washington at that time. I had an elderly father-in-law, still do. He's 98 years old. He lived up here, was not allowed to go outside as long as the sky looked like that because of the particulate matter in the air. So I'm going to tell you about two people whose lives, they don't know each other, but they're connected by this. So one of these people who I talk about in the book is Sam Perkins. He's a firefighter. He's not just a wildland firefighter. He jumps out of airplanes and parachutes down in front of forest fires to try to stop them. He's called a smoke jumper. And there are hundreds of people who did this during the Labor Day fires. And at great peril to themselves, also working in communities, helping people move their livestock, helping people move their families. He's a caretaker par excellence. His father was a wildland firefighter who fought fires that were thousands of acres. Sam fights fires that are millions of acres. And one of the things he wanted me to know is that the job of wildland firefighters is not just treacherous, in the physical ways that you might imagine. They also have the highest suicide rates of almost any profession. And part of that is related to structural issues about healthcare, mental health care, and the number of people we have working on these issues. He wanted me to know that the U.S. Forest Service budget, the entire U.S. Forest Service budget, devotes half of everything it has to putting out fires. Not training firefighters, not working for their health care, not preventing firefighters. They spend half of their budget putting fires out, right? And they don't have enough money for that. So what Sam does is he does a lot of talking. He does a lot of work to try to help this industry. And he's actually gone to different countries, Nepal and elsewhere, and trained Forest Service people there because he knows that when a forest goes up in Nepal, the CO2 that goes out ends up out here and everywhere else too, right? Now, one other thing to think about, this is a different fire, remnants of the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa, California, which is north of San Francisco, is that this is a land use issue. That's another structural part of this problem. The land use issue is that sprawl pushes housing in a lot of places where arguably it shouldn't be to begin with, right? Why? We'll take a look at this. That cost of housing, as almost everybody seems to know in the world now, in San Francisco is just out of control, right? So if you're going to work in the Bay Area, where are you going to live? You're going to live in suburban communities that go up and up and up into these areas that are closer to fire. So one structural issue with firefighters and with wildfires has to do with land use planning and housing affordability, right? You might have not thought if you were interested in housing affordability that you were working on climate resilience, but you might be. And even in communities like this, where cheaper housing goes in places that are flood prone, right? Same thing. So these are issues that we have to work on in a lot of ways. Now, this story's still not over because I haven't talked to you about Cynthia Moore, whose picture I showed you up there. And she lives where I grew up. I'm third generation Las Vegas, okay? And I grew up in the Mojave Desert. And I show you this particular map because the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, have created a whole set of maps showing social vulnerability in counties and parishes around the United States. Social vulnerability describes the type of identities that people have that are often associated with vulnerability to disaster. So it's things like lower income, linguistic isolation, race, education, disability, a raft of things. And what we know is that those vulnerabilities actually are more important than the physical vulnerabilities, like being next to a hurricane or being next to an earthquake or being next to something else, right? It's these other vulnerabilities that are a layer on top that make things much, much worse. And these folks are the folks who are on the front lines of climate change because of that. So I just want you to see in my home state, right, where the vulnerability is in that way. Now, Cynthia Moore lives in a community, actually very close to the neighborhood that I grew up in. She's in a Latino community. She was a real estate agent. She got a different job because during the fires down in Southern California, the city of Las Vegas was caped in sort of whiskey-colored skies for many, many days. And her young son, who has a respiratory illness, had to stay inside the whole time. She had to go spend a lot of money on an air filtration system for her house. She had to go help the neighbors, all of these kinds of things. So what does she do? She becomes an activist about air pollution control in the city of Las Vegas, because she wants to clamp down on other kinds of pollution that can be regulated, because firefighter or wildfire pollution can't be regulated. And so she worked on that for a while. Last time I talked to her on the phone, she had a different job. She's an environmental justice activist for the entire state of Nevada, one of the largest umbrella organizations for environmental justice. I said, what are you working on? She says, we're working on heat stress now. So Las Vegas it had some of the largest heat alerts of anywhere in the country last summer. Triple digits. Next is triple digits, next to triple digits, next to triple digits, right? And she was working for a worker safety law that would guarantee outdoor workers in the state of Nevada water, shade, and rest. All right, there are only like 4 or 5 states in the entire country that guarantee those things. Nevada is not one of them. Arizona is not one of them. New Mexico is not one of them. In Texas, it's illegal for municipalities to guarantee water, heat, and rest to outdoor workers, right? So they were so close to getting this passed, and they actually failed there. This is an issue that's going to be really important for lots of places in the country, including Iowa, right? Because you've got lots of outside workers. And you've got, well, you're in a drought now, right? During the summer droughts, and you've also got these heat waves that are going to be coming. And heat waves are the biggest killer in the United States of any weather-related disaster. 7 times more people die of heat wave every year than floods. 700 people die every year. And it mainly affects, or rather the disproportionate effect is on blacks and Latinos in the United States. We have, you might know, a Stafford Act, Natural Disaster Act, that lets the president declare major disasters and unlock lots of money. The one thing that's not mentioned in the Stafford Act is heat wave. Why? Because heat waves aren't associated with property damage, right? And so these are the kinds of structural things to think about, right? And how might law be able to unlock some of this? The moral of these stories that I'm telling you, a lot of morals about fairness, all right? Just to sort of understand public health versus property and other things. Well, I'm going to stay in the Southwest just for a moment, if it's okay with you, because the next thing I wanted to do is go to a place that I loved as a kid, Joshua Tree. It wasn't a national park when I was a kid. Now it's a national park. There are Joshua trees. They're beautiful. Hundreds of different species rely on these trees. You can see beautiful parts of them, or beautiful expressions of them in Joshua Tree National Park. You know from an Eagles album, right? What that look at. People think the U2 album, but no, it's the Eagles album that has a Joshua Tree National Park in there. And I wanted to know more about Joshua trees, so I went out there and I went hiking and camping out in the areas there, and I met Jane Rogers, who is now the superintendent of Joshua Tree National Park. She started out as a climate resilience volunteer in the Peace Corps in Niger, working in flooded communities. Now she's working in bake communities. And here's the story about Joshua trees. They might not exist in Joshua Tree National Park by the end of the century. Why? Because they actually need cooler weather. And so they retreat, I'll say, up into the mountains where it gets cooler. Now, these are what are called refugia. Let's see. Oh, anyway, these are called refugia up there, which just means that where might Joshua Tree be able to survive? And you can see as the temperatures go up, fewer and fewer places in that park will they be able to survive at all, right? Now, most of this area in this national park is wilderness area, which some of you may know if you study natural resources law. But let's just say it's one of the most protected types of federal land that you can have in the United States. Very little that you can do in wilderness area in terms of bringing in machinery or these kinds of things, right? So that's usually a good thing, we think, because it keeps people out. All right. Here's the problem. Joshua trees are burning down at record levels, in part because of forest fires that are brought on by these invasive grasses that become fuel. Okay, so lots of Joshua trees are burning down. Could you plant new Joshua trees in these areas? Could you come in and cut using machinery these grasslands? The answer, because of the Wilderness Act, is probably no. And so in some parts of the park, the minority of the park, you'll see workers out there, as I did when I went out there, using weed whackers and replanting. They have a greenhouse and they're growing little Joshua trees and they're moving them around. But they can't do that, or at least won't do that in any of the wilderness areas because of the paperwork involved in the bureaucracy. So the laws are fixed and not flexible. So in addition to laws that are fair, we need laws that are more flexible. Now, you might say, why don't these trees, maybe they'll just move. I mean, forests actually do move, and Joshua trees have moved in the past too, because animals eat the seeds, the animals scatter around, they leave the seeds in their waste, and then new forests grow. Maybe they could do that again. The problem is the animal that distributed all the Joshua tree seeds, we don't have anymore. All right, because it was these giant sloths that did that, and the little tiny rabbits, they don't move far enough, right? So Joshua trees are not going to move anywhere unless we do it for them. And the sequoia forests, which are also in a national park, they might not survive unless we can bring sprinkler systems in for them. Do we want to do that? So all of this is about our natural resources laws being more flexible. This is not just a problem with Joshua Tree. These are all of the national parks. The national parklands, for a variety of reasons, because they're very sensitive, have less rain and are getting hotter and hotter. And our laws that protect them are not going to match what needs to happen. Now, let's talk about having a little bit too much water, okay? This is in my backyard. I'm actually working with some of the groups that are involved in southern Louisiana, which has already lost 2,000 square miles of its land in the last 75 years. Much of it to the oil and gas industry, which has destroyed the wetlands, the largest contiguous wetlands in North America. And so this is 2% of what that island used to be. And the New York Times, referred to these folks as the climate refugees. They're members of the Black Sea Chitimacha Choctaw, the Ile de Jean Charles band of that tribe. They're not federally recognized. They wanted to retreat. They wanted to leave and move somewhere else and relocate, and then invite all the other members of the Chitimacha Choctaw who had left previously for the same sorts of reasons. And they're not a federally recognized tribe. So I'll just point out a few things. One, you can see down here, there's another social vulnerability map, right? Here's where these folks are. There's a road that goes to their island, and on a good day, that's what it looks like. It actually is a place that's really good for fishing. You can park your truck there and fish right outside the window, and people do it. But so the issue is they applied for a federal grant from HUD. They got $40+ million to move their community. But because they weren't federally recognized, they couldn't receive the money themselves. It had to go to the state of Louisiana. And so the state of Louisiana used their proposal, right, to get that $40 million. This is what the area looks like from which people were leaving. There's Chief Albert Napkin, who's a friend of our law school and whom I've talked with many times about this. He helped orchestrate a lot of this. And they, in their proposal, they had a plan that was going to be renewable energy and so on. They were going to have community centers, and they were going to acquire land, build this new community center, and move the folks who are on the island, and then also move the other folks from the Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw who had to leave previously, right? What happened is they lost complete control of it. And the state of Louisiana refused even to talk to the tribal leadership as it planned the relocation. It acquired land without even notifying the tribe or asking them if they liked the land. And it chose building concepts without even talking to the tribal leadership, although they talked to individual people on the island. That's what it looks like now. And the Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw tribe essentially said they didn't want anything to do with it. So some individual people are living there. Some other people on the island who aren't members of that tribe are living there. But the tribe itself doesn't want anything to do with this, and they're calling it a failure, and they're trying to find money from private sources. This is a structural problem for sure. It's a problem that shows that law not only is not necessarily fair, but that it's not forward-looking. We've known for generations that these communities will need to move, and we've done nothing about that. There are at least 12 different communities in the United States that want to move in total on account of climate change. All of them are indigenous communities. Most of them are in Alaska, there's some in Washington State, and there's the one I'm just describing. There is no federal agency devoted to relocating people on account of climate change. 12 million people in our century will be moving from the coast because of sea level rise. And we actually know where they're going to be moving. We know they're going to be moving from places like Miami and New Orleans and Los Angeles, and we know they're going to be moving to places like Austin and Las Vegas and Orlando. Is anyone bringing these people together to talk? No. Is there any federal money of any substantial size devoted to helping these relocations happen? No. And so we're not looking ahead. We're pretending that everything's fixed. And so that's another thing that we're going to have to change. I have a long discussion in the book with Sherelle Parfait-Dardar, another friend. She's with the Grand Caillou Duloc band in the same area. My center at Loyola, Center for Environmental Land and Law, is working with their groups. They've lost complete trust with the government and with the federal government too. And so one of the things that we're all trying to do is figure out ways where they can get recognition to at least speak with some of the federal regulators and figure out how they can preserve some of their lands. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is the ocean. I'm writing about the ocean in a new book, and so I quite I'm interested in these issues these days. Suffice it for you to know that the ocean is really important to you, even if you're in the middle of the country. Every other breath that you have taken in the class today comes from the ocean, which is another way of saying 50% of the oxygen comes from plant life in the ocean. The ocean regulates our currents, it regulates the weather, even here, and it's responsible for providing food to 90% of all people in poverty in the world. And so if we lose coral reefs or if we lose the rest of the fisheries, we've got big trouble. One of the most fun interviews I think I had was Cara Norman, who at the time was 14 years old. She's a middle school student, and she helps rebuild coral reefs. She learned in middle school in an after-school activity how to dive. She was with a lot of girls in middle school in Key West who wanted to learn how to dive because they liked the Disney movies. And later they got turned on to science. They didn't like science in their schools, but they liked science when they were diving. Cara Norman is now in high school. She's the principal investigator on peer-reviewed studies of coral restoration. And she and tens of thousands of novice and volunteer divers around the world are working at growing corals in offshore nurseries, finding robust specimens, and then replacing them in certain kinds of reefs. Now, you might think, well, is that really a way to go about fixing coral? It might be part of the solution. We know that because the second largest barrier reef in the world is the Mesoamerican barrier reef. It's right off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. If you've been to Belize or the Yucatan, you might have seen the fish that live in those coral reefs. They put an insurance policy on it. Honest to gosh, they've got Swiss Re, an insurance company, that pays out a certain amount of money anytime there's a storm of a certain size, and that money goes directly to volunteer divers who then help put the reef together. And it works so well that Hawaii just instituted one too. And so these are the first health insurance policies for ecosystems in the world. And they're based on work that people like Cara Norman are doing, right? And I just love that. You see, ask Cara or her friends, and I was at a book signing in Miami, and I met them all. They all came out. They all want to be marine scientists, right? Because of Finding Nemo, right? And because they decided that they were going to take up something like diving. And there are peer review articles, right? They're saying that, look, if we did this in certain places and spot welded the most important reefs in the world, we might be able to help in some way. So what I have done in to me is a short time is try to introduce you to this idea that we need champions and we need changes in structure. And we need champions who are helping to make changes in structure. And if we do that, we can build laws that are fair, that are flexible, and that are forward-looking. And all of those things are within our reach in this room. You just have to figure it out, what it is that you're interested in and how climate might affect it. And then ask yourself, what can I learn more about and talk to people more about in this way? There's a lot of bad news, but we don't have to despair because the opposite of despair is action. And so I will end there. I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but I would love to answer some questions.
Thank you. Incredibly inspirational.
Oh, thank you.
Which is really hard to do. I can already see the hand, so I'm gonna bring the microphone.
Thank you for coming. This was a fantastic talk. You
Thank
talked
you.
a little bit about density and sprawl and the way that impacts climate.
Yeah.
So one of the big issues, especially in places like California, is old legacy environmental review laws like CEQA or the national level NEPA. So how do you convince legacy environmental groups that see those laws as a big part of their day-to-day work to adapt and allow for greater density and things like that, and frame that as a climate issue as opposed to a fossil fuel issue? And how do you reframe that issue? Thanks.
Thanks for that. So first of all, your reference to CEQA, which is an environmental assessment law in California, and then NEPA, which is the same thing in the federal level, the environmental impact statements and so on. I want to push back a little bit on that because I'm not sure myself that it's those laws that are keeping housing from being built in California or other good things that we might want, although they may be part of the issue. And I'm certainly open to the idea that some federal laws like the Wilderness Act might be too inflexible. But the bigger point I think that you're making that I would completely agree with is that there are a lot of things that progressives used to like, or maybe still like, that seem incompatible with the things that I'm talking about, like density in cities and more housing and maybe more traffic and this sort of thing. And I think you lead with information, right? And I'm seeing a change, at least in some progressive communities that I work with, of saying, look, you have to allow growth to be somewhere. You can't have smart growth in dumb places, right? You have to have smart growth in smart places, and that might be in places that you treasure that are going to have to change culturally. We have maybe more to talk about, but I think that you are exactly right. There has to be a cultural shift on the progressive side as well.
Is there? Is there an organization working on model legislation the way that ALEC works on model legislation for conservative causes, so that people who are not up to speed on the political or legal issues can go someplace and know that this piece of legislation will help address whatever issue they're concerned with?
The answer is yes, but they're not as organized as ALEC. Right? ALEC is the name of an organization that makes state-based. Okay, all right, yeah. So I'll say Rewiring America is one place that I would look. That's a group that actually helped push for the Inflation Reduction Act, and has a lot of connections with Sunrise Group and others. I am president of a group of law professors called Center for Progressive Reform, and we also develop policy papers and recommend certain kinds of legislation, although we don't lobby. I guess I would have to say that a lot of these the NRDC and the Environmental Defense Fund, they also do these kinds of things, but not in the kind of orchestrated way that you were talking about. And I think we need that. Yeah.
I am actually from Hawaii.
Oh, right.
I'm studying here, so I'm an ocean girl. I get it. I totally get it. I'm also working on a research project that focuses on the impact of the agriculture in Iowa on the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm wondering, like, what do you see in the future of that? Because they're hitting a brick wall. There's so many lobbyists for the agricultural industry. I'm wondering, what do you see in the future of that?
Do y'all know what the dead zone is? Okay, so I'm so glad to hear that, because we in Louisiana know what the dead zone is. You know, I show my students the map. Plaquemines Parish goes all the way down. I said, Louisiana is a human colon, both in form and substance, right? Because 2/3 of the nation's waste, right, just goes there and then creates hypoxia, right? And I think it's really, really hard to solve that problem without national leadership bringing the upper and the lower parts of the Mississippi River, the states, together. EPA has that authority. Congress could do it itself. And I've pushed for things like that in the past, but I think it's very, very hard. And it's so hard because we're all fractured in that way. But what affects us down there affects you, and of course, vice versa. And so I guess I don't have anything concrete except to say that there is a lot of funding coming out of the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act that does go to trying to help farmers limit some of the nutrients that go into the rivers. We need more of that kind of work. But with this Supreme Court and the kinds of regulation that's possible, I think it's just really, really tough, unfortunately.
Thanks. I'm concerned about, I mean, as are many people for many reasons, democracy's future.
Mhm.
And what I heard people I know in the voting rights community express concern about the political, societal effects of climate change. And, we've kind of taken for granted in the West that the last more than a century has been, a steady increase of democratic reform, democratic accountability, expansion of the franchise. And now data are showing very real democratic backsliding.
Mhm.
And do you think there's a danger that the nations of the world, not just the US, will sort of, as we hit crisis after crisis and unmanageable social energies start making things difficult for government, that there will be an acceptance that democracy is a luxury, and the West will figure out some way to plausibly adapt with overt institutions, but people, those who remember will know that something has happened and that decisions have been made, and it will be perhaps too late to know, because the institutions will look the same, but will not be the same.
Well, that's a bright question. There's really something to that. I mean, democracy, obviously, responsive, accountable democracy is important to so much protection of public health and the environment, obviously. And I think back to, there's a Nobel-winning economist, Amartya Sen, who wrote about the relationship between democracy and responding to citizens during disasters. And what he argued is that he made this famous argument, there's never been a famine, he said, in a working democracy. And what he meant by that is that famines, along with all kinds of quote unquote natural disasters, are really disasters and catastrophes of government response and government planning too. And when your leaders aren't held accountable, then they don't feel that they have to do the sorts of things you would expect of a democratic leader. I mean, just think about our response to Puerto Rico, for instance, where the amount of help that went to American citizens in Puerto Rico was dwarfed by that went to folks in Texas, who deserved it too, in Houston. But if you were to compare those two things, you'll just see there was a huge gulf. And that was, I think, because of democratic accountability, I would say. And so it's really important that we keep our democracy and that we keep people accountable to things. It's worth saying that in the Biden administration, there's a movement right now to make more public accountability in the rulemaking process, which in the regulatory process, which many law students don't even understand that well. And so I'm always a fan of teaching administrative law and regulatory law and so on, because people have to understand how those kinds of laws are made. And I think that activists and advocates need to understand all the different lever points of power, whether it's federal regulation, which is different from legislation, and also state regulation and state legislation. When I work in these organizations, and when I get down about what the feds are doing, depending on the cycle we're in, then I go for the states. And then if I get down on certain states, then I look at the federal government. And I think you just have to always be plotting your power map. And I'm just acknowledging what you're saying. I of course, don't have a solution to what you're saying, but I think that it's a real problem. And you're right, democracy is at the root of everything.
And I'm not so concerned about the one-off like Houston or
Yeah.
Yeah. But down the road, sort of decision, at a macro level, that democracy, in the face of these huge pressures, they'll anticipate climate change is going to be worse, and you're much more plugged into how bad it could get.
Yeah.
That there will be a conscious societal.
Well, and we're seeing that in changes of information too. I mean, another part of democracy is having reliable information and ways to judge what information is reliable and what isn't. And we have disinformation campaigns that are very sophisticated, as you know, and I think that's a problem too.
I'm gonna jump in here. I think I don't want to shut down questions, but we only have 5 minutes.
Only 5 minutes,
And I
okay.
wanna ask.
Oh, yeah.
Listen, selfish, because I know that there are students who are taking environmental law this semester in the room and watching online. And it's not a part of the book that you actually highlighted, but I wonder if you could say a little bit about your interactions with the environmental justice advocates and activists in Cancer Alley. That part of the book, I think if you're an environmental student learning about or learning about pollution control laws, right, like the Clean Air Act, can be very surprising, right, to find out that these flares happen and that much goes unmonitored and unnoticed, especially without the advocacy that you describe in the book. So I really wanted to give you a chance to highlight for that.
Yeah, I write about, let me back up very quickly. Let's see. I write about one particular activist, Sharon Levine, who's in her 70s. She's the winner of the Goldman Prize, which is a Nobel, they call it the Nobel for environmental justice activism. She lives in Cancer Alley, and I talk with her quite a bit. She visits with my students, and she really taught me to understand the relationship between pollution control and these disasters. She lives in a place called St. James, and after Hurricane Ida, I went down there with another colleague of mine. We helped deliver ice and food and things. She was putting together a whole program of volunteers, and we were part of that. And she says, jump in my car, I want to show you something. And so she drives me to a styrofoam plant called American Styrene. And it's hard maybe to see, but there are a couple of flares up there. I took this picture, she asked me to, so she could put it on Facebook. And these flares were pumping unknown amounts of very dangerous chemicals into the air that were actually causing respiratory illness on the ground. Why were they doing it? It was because they call them accidental releases. They had to release them because the pressure was so high in the factory that they were afraid it would explode. How did it get to a situation like that? The power was out, right? It was a hurricane. The power was out. Did they have supplemental supplies of power? No, right? This happens every single time there's a big storm and a power outage. So she says, I want to put this on paper. I took a little video with her phone and so on. I write about that in the book. And you might not think about what she's doing as climate resilience, but it is, right? Because she's saying that the people in her community are going to have more toxic chemicals they have to breathe anytime there's a power outage that's related to a storm. And because our laws are not requiring those companies to show that they have other ways of dealing with a predictable power outage, that it's just sort of business as usual. And what I was trying to do, I talked to her about this. I said, I want to tell this as a climate story. And she's like, yeah, it's an everything story. Her house she'd lost the roof on her house 2 days before I took this picture. And I was in her house. She'd lost everything in her house. And she wants me to drive with her to take pictures of this, right? It's just amazing the commitment that people there have. And they connect all the dots. They understand that all of this is connected to climate and to money and to everything else.
Thank you. I think this is a good place to end. Maybe as we transition, it's particularly willing to take a question or two. And I think sign some books. We'll find a way to do that. We have to let a class come in here at 2:00. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for giving me the chance to.
I know that the doctor.
Oh, great. Oh, that's good. I like that.
I hate to shut things down.
I went a little longer than I thought I would too, so that's all right.
You know what? I think
It worked well? Yeah, I know.
Great job, Rob. That was really great. And that's so great to meet you. It was really enjoyable.
I know.
Yeah, it was very good. So far.
I remember you because you have personal classes.
I did. I sure did. That is amazing. That is amazing. That is amazing. Last time I saw you, Loyola was doing like all four law school workshop. Right as I was leaving to go to the University of Oklahoma.
So are you here?
I am. I've been here for 4 years, although I'm leaving to go to Texas A&M at the end of this semester. Be a little closer to.
Oh, congratulations. I know that.
Yeah, those days are all over. So John is gone now. Oh, shoot. Yeah, I keep in touch with him.
Oh, good.
But I know somebody can work on Dion is.
Dion is of course. Yeah. So we got a whole.
We have one by, she was younger than me, but she were on law school, just over there.
Oh,
I was a 3-0, she was a.
oh, wow. Yeah, I love you.
It's just
Oh, that's great.
I would say to that.
I look forward to it.
Oh, good. All right, email me and let me know what you think.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, I will.
Take care.
Sure. Hi.
My quick question was, if you have suggestions for organizations, are you calling it?
Oh, the teaching.
They all want.
I can, if you send me. One of my colleagues.
Let's get out of here. So sorry.
Yeah.
We have like a table up there. Okay. Okay, bye. We made it to our Route 14 made it to the quarterfinals.
Everyone.
Every single one got best of world.
Okay.
Okay, here.